Good morning, all. I think that we should get started with this April Environment, Energy, and Sustainability Network webinar. I'm Sarah Simon. I'm the coordinator of the network. We are a group of MIT groups who are all involved in those three issues. A lot of times we talk about it as climate. Today, though, we're going to look at resiliency and the electric system in Puerto Rico. We all know that the island nations have had a particularly interesting challenge in the changing world that we live in. They've had to import fossil fuels to make their power and electricity, and the sea level is rising like crazy. So not crazy, it's rising, and it's threatening many much of the coastal areas around the world, but on an island, of course, this is even more important. Today's webinar is a webinar. You will not be able to do the chat from the audience. However, our panelists can put information in the chat for you, things like links to the EESN website or other issues like that. You can, though, please put questions into the question and answer notice. So we're about to start and talk about the resilient electricity and clean electricity that Puerto Rico wants and needs. We have with us some excellent panelists, and I'd just like to start by introducing my great backup on the webinars for EESN, Ramón Bueno. He has some good experience and information about Puerto Rico and its electric system. Ramón is an astro graduate from MIT, and then later he worked for his master's with what is now called the Lab for Information and Decision Systems, LIDS. He worked on climate economics groups at Tufts and at the Stockholm, which was partnered with the Stockholm Environment Institute. So he has worked for a long time on some of these issues and the decision tools and the modeling that is needed to work for that. He currently serves on Somerville's Public Commission on Energy Use and Climate Change. So Ramón, I hand it over to you to introduce the rest of this
Thank you, Sarah, and
session.
Welcome to everyone who is attending. Looking forward to the conversations here. It's a little bit of a changing hat for me, but we'll go forward anyway. I'm going to introduce briefly our two other guest speakers here, and then we'll proceed. So I will speak first briefly for a few comments, and then next will be Agustín Carbó-Lugo, who is currently the Energy Transition Manager in Puerto Rico for Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. He's been doing that since 2019. Notably, he back in 2014, when the Puerto Rico newly created the Energy Commission, the first time regulatory body, he was the first president of it for the first few years. He's worked in a number of and advised in a number of national, international, private, public, and nonprofit organizations, including the EPA, and as executive director of the PR Solid Waste Authority. He graduated from Vermont Law School, and he holds a BS in Civil and a Master's in Environmental Engineering from Northeastern University and a MEM from Yale University in Environmental Policy Analysis. And then after that, Marcel Castro Citiriche will speak, who is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez, the main engineering campus. And he's also a co-director of the Center for Hemispheric Cooperation in Research and Education in Engineering and Applied Science. That's COEMI, with a Caribbean focus as well. He has research interests that include energy justice, appropriate technology for that, rural electrification, solar microgrids, and on. He holds a BS in electrical engineering from the UPR in Mayagüez and a PhD in electrical engineering from Howard University. So having said that, I'll proceed with the starting comments, and then Agustín will follow me. Let me set myself a little timer here. Share the screen. So my comments are going to be on a few lessons that I, would like to point out about climate change and resilient power in Puerto Rico. I'll start with a quote from Frank Ackerman, who I had the honor and the good luck to work with for a number of years at the Climate Economics Group, the late Frank Ackerman, which was, for uncertain extreme risks, policy should not be based on the should be based on credible worst case outcome, not the expected or most likely value. The point there is that if it's bad enough, you have to prepare for that, not for what you think you can calculate as likely. And once you do identify that, then you find the most affordable and cost-effective way to get there as quickly and as easily as possible, because adapting to the unavoidable is the other part of what you have to do. Without a doubt, I think Puerto Rico, especially since 2017, definitely meets the mark for that, and which translates into there's no time to waste. For those interested, before he passed away, Frank had some very interesting brief blog pieces on this topic. I'm not going to get into this thing. I just wanted to point out, for those who are interested in more technical stuff, the slides will be available one day. But the first one, it's interesting because recently, last month, the DOE, the Department of Energy, launched a project, PR100, with 6 national laboratories to do very detailed modeling and from many different angles and stakeholders' perspectives on how to meet the 100% renewable energy challenge for 2050, which, as we'll see, is quite a challenge for Puerto Rico. I'm going to do a little quick prelude to some prior conditions because well before, and this is how climate change and other conditions interact, well before the 2017 hurricane devastation, Puerto Rico was already in a very deep economic tough situation, even before the downturn in the world economy in 2018, and before what I call the Irma Maria 1-2 punch, because Irma and Maria came together 2 weeks apart. And one of the concerns is, in addition to the obvious, is that because Puerto Rico doesn't have any federal representation, there are real consequences to that. And one example of that, in my opinion, is that here we are 4 or 5 years later, and there's substantial approved federal recovery funds and just barely really arriving in any substance. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically, as I said, the economic crisis, and a lot of that is outside Puerto Rico's control, because there were substantial federal incentives that, when they were removed, led to the exodus of a lot of firms. But that and a number of other practices and conditions led to a lot of debt for the island, 75 billion plus 15 of pension obligations, but also the power utility had a substantial debt as well. 9 billion, 9 US billions, and 10 when you add the pensions. And maybe not surprisingly, 2 months before the hurricanes, they had declared bankruptcy. This in the middle of a very complex society, because there's a large middle class, but there's also a lot of unemployment, a lot of poverty and inequality, aging population, a lot of immigration. So it was kind of unfortunately perfect conditions for the disaster in some ways. Just very briefly, Puerto Rico, is covered east-west by mountain range in the middle. The population is highly concentrated in the northeast and the San Juan metro area. And in this graph here, I'd like to just point out briefly, the income levels are most pronounced and highest in the San Juan metro area, but notice the opposite is true at the southwest, and that'll be relevant in a minute. Just to the degree that GDP means anything as an indicator of economic activity and so on, Puerto Rico has actually a higher per capita income than all but a couple of outliers in Latin America. However, compared to the United States, to the states in the United States, let's say against Mississippi, which is the poorest state, Puerto Rico on average, per capita has half the income and yet twice the poverty rate. So that's part of a challenge and the picture between interacting with climate change. Anybody who's been in San Juan, who's been to Old San Juan and to Condado, right on the beach, you see the photo below. On the one hand, it's fantastic. It's a beautiful area that you can just step outside wherever you are and you're right at the water. But it's a very densely right on the water's edge, densely populated. In the age of climate change, that has its own challenges. Just down the coast, not very far, where the airport is, and there's a beautiful Isla Verde beach, we have basically the busiest airport in the Caribbean, only a stone's throw from the waterfront, and highly vulnerable, basic infrastructure. And the same thing can be said for a number of the power plants in the island that are right on the water or right next to the water. Not all, but some of them. So from a climate change perspective, this is kind of the undeniable reality. And this chart from the 1960s on shows a steady, unrelenting climb in sea level rise, which you can imagine what that means for those photos that I just sent you. This is Aurelio Mercado at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, has been tracking that for decades. The Puerto Rico Climate Change Council has been studying all of these things since it was founded about 12 years ago. And most recently had its 11th summit last month, very, very good presentations. And there's an upcoming release of its latest state of climate. But even before the hurricanes, these are photos that had nothing to do with the hurricanes. And this is something that local scientists and experts have been calling out for many, many, many years. Yeah, it's saying, you know, we cannot do things that ignore the larger environment and where it's heading. And yet inadequate structures placed in inadequate places lead to these predictable conditions. Imagine what then happens after a hurricane. Well, this is what happens. This is in 2017 after Maria, which came, the unique thing about that is there were 3 highest category hurricanes within a month. That's not very, very usual. And in Puerto Rico, 2 weeks before Maria, Irma, another high category devastating hurricane for the whole region, hit the northeast of Puerto Rico. And even though within a couple of weeks, there was some recovery, over 1 million customers had lost power for several days and damages were in the 1,000 million range. Not too long later, when in the very end of 2019, when many people in some parts of the island were still not, you know, recovered from the hurricanes, highly unusual. I had never seen anything like this. Earthquakes of this magnitude started hitting that same southwest area that I mentioned that was sort of the lowest income section of the island. The devastation was even worse. If anybody's familiar with these earthquake magnitudes, you know that those are incredibly powerful. So that what started then and went into 2020 with very strong recurrences. Many people in that area were basically afraid to sleep in their own homes, even if their homes were not destroyed. So there was a lot of sheltering and so on. And immediately after that, the pandemic hits, telling people that you have to stay apart. So this is an example of how extreme phenomena can change in a way, unexpected ways, that the pre-existing resilience or lack of makes a huge difference. What I see in this new normal is that the scale, intensity, pace, and frequency of these extreme weather phenomena in particular are something that now has to be dealt with. Harvey in Texas, Dorian in Bahamas a few years later, basically stayed in place for like a day. The precipitation was just overwhelming. In Puerto Rico, Maria developed from a meager starting tropical storm to a high category hurricane in the matter of a day or so. So it's something that people are not yet traditionally prepared for. And then it raises a question, when you have something like this happen, what if something else happens within a short time? In this case, a minor storm a week or a month later in the same hurricane season would have been completely devastating, or the next year. So one of the lessons is that when you're in the front line of these extreme climate risk, being prepared for very fast and adequate proportionate action is not optional. It's the new reality for everyone. And adaptation to the oncoming, predicted changes is the urgent task. Maria, basically, in terms of lost electricity in the island, in terms of customer hours of lost electricity, was the second in the world at that time. And then by, we're looking at 3,300 some million lost hours in an island of around 3 million. So that's unbelievable. And in the US, it was by far the biggest. I'm not going to read this. This is just pulling out from a very good description. Hold on a second. some of the things that are coming at play here, extreme weather events, insufficient resilience, vulnerability, crisis, financial constraints, lack of capability, and then additional population vulnerabilities. This tells a big part of the picture. This is the recovery from the peak outage in Sandy in New York and New Jersey, Harvey, and then Puerto Rico. It's orders of magnitude larger with the time it took to recover, 75, 100% of the outage. The electricity in Puerto Rico was already twice the average on, in general, than most parts of the United States. And the purchasing power, as we said before, is on the poor side. So the effective energy burden is quadruple or more what most people in the United States, families and businesses. So that has big consequences. And then the same folks are the ones who are most burdened because you have this incredibly long outage. Along with that is this kind of inequality of deaths. Only a few dozen people died from the hurricane, but there were some additional 3,000 in the coming year that came primarily from interrupted healthcare and so on. And as one perhaps should be surprised, but isn't, when you look at it in terms of the income levels, the people in the lowest income levels basically for several months had not only the worst, but rising mortality rates. So the lesson there is that really unequal energy and economic burdens impose vastly disproportionate impact. And the issue of resilience and equitable resilience, it's not just a nice slogan, it's actually a crucial element. And just another quick thing, often it's said, well, that's the urban rural divide, but in Puerto Rico, I'm not going to get into the details here, but if you look at the colors, this is a breakdown by census blocks of different combinations of vulnerable population and energy burden and per capita demand of electricity and so on. What's common to all of them is that within the metropolitan area, this is the area around San Juan, there are areas that were drastically more vulnerable, but even pockets of it all over the place. So this is an issue for the entire island, and it is true for other places. Puerto Rico, electricity is crucial. You can see here that in the Caribbean, it's nothing even remotely comes close to that level of electrification. And when you lose that, you lose your livelihood. And I'm wrapping up very soon here. This is the fuel imports that go into the electricity system. This is before the 8 years before the hurricanes. We're looking at $1.5 to $3,000 million. That's the substantial amount of money that leaves the island and it doesn't circulate. And that's all fossil fuel because some in the upper 90s of the generation is in the upper 90% is really fossil fuel based. Nobody's surprised that fossil fuels are highly volatile, including this year. So electricity prices have gone up several times already. This is a huge drain on the island because aside from this, Puerto Rico is a leading importer of goods of U.S. goods and in general on a scale that very few places match it, and I would say in the world. So the resources for livelihood, for economic development and so on are very important. So the final lesson I'm drawing here is that huge expenditures on the very things that are worsening your climate risk, that's a high priority to phase out. And it's also essential to meet the goals by the law to meet the 100% renewable energy for 2050. And there's just huge, in addition to that, huge potential benefits in health and economic growth. So just to wrap it up, adaptation is really a top priority because of the climate risk and the urgency. Decarbonizing is huge because of what I just mentioned, that the huge expenditures are a huge drain. Unequal burdens worsen the resilience gaps, which makes you more vulnerable coming around the next hurricane season. And so basically the bottom line is that there's no room for solution silos. All of these things have to be tackled at the same time. Because for example, if the vast majority of the population in Puerto Rico had a living standard close to the middle class, the same devastating hurricanes would not have had that same deadly impact. And a crucial element, I think, is that local science and academic expertise, as well as local community knowledge, has to play a much more upfront role and a persistent role because they're being sidelined or not taken into account enough, has compounded this resilience deficit in Puerto Rico. And this is a lesson that I think is true, not just in Puerto Rico, this is everywhere. Fortunately, there are initiatives, and this is just a few examples of community initiatives in terms of trying to reclaim some control over local power. Some of these are co-ops and so on. And some of these, 2 weeks ago, when the power outage for several days, some of these places had communities that they didn't suffer. Now, folks outside in the mainland sometimes say, you know, how can we get involved in projects? But what's the proper approach? And I think given all of that we just covered, one of the things that's really crucial is that you have to be in tune with the local conditions that people and institutions have been dealing with for not just years, but decades. Because so much exodus of money leaves the island, high circulation of resources makes a big difference. And local workforce engagement is crucial. These are some examples of folks in the mainland that have been engaging in projects with that kind of philosophy. So with that, I'll thank you. And just a couple of networks of folks who have been dealing with, you know, how to improve resilience and so on. These will be available in the slides. Thank you very much. Next, we'll have Agustín join us and speak. Agustín?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just waiting for my slides to go up. Thank you, Ramón. That was a good presentation, and thank you for the invitation. I'm also, I apologize for any background noise because I'm actually in the island of Culebra, which is 17 miles east of the main island of Puerto Rico. We just launched what I call a climate adaptation mitigation energy resiliency project. We will be solarizing 40 residential houses, and we're still doing some fundraising to add at least 10 more. But we just launched the project a few days ago, and that's the reason I'm here, and you'll hear all the background noise around me. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the regulatory background and the planning process and climate implications, and how the local laws have inserted climate issues into the discussion, which I think is very important to put in perspective when we want to find solutions that are holistic and can provide benefits for the communities in general. Next slide, please. So in what I'm going to be talking is the Puerto Rico Energy Public Policy, how it pretty much evolved. It's a very new statute. For more than before 2014, pretty much the public utility was self-regulated, and basically they were on their own doing anything they wanted, and no controls, no way to have them accounted for everything that pretty much has happened in terms of you know, the huge legacy debt that now we will have to pay as customers for the island. Then talk about the planning process, which is the Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP, which has been an important tool for planning the future for Puerto Rico in terms of energy. And finally, community involvement, because I think that's where a lot of solutions can really come from. I think Ramón gave you good examples of other local groups that are doing great energy work in the island, but that's the reason we came to Puerto Rico, to try to help them with solutions from a community perspective, and building those solutions from them rather than imposing them from top to bottom. Next slide. So I work for the Environmental Defense Fund. This is one of the oldest international environmental organizations, nonprofit organizations in the world. We are headquartered in New York City, but we have a presence in Asia, Europe, India, and the United States, and of course, Latin America. We basically have we've tried to find solutions for environmental problems intersecting science, economy, and the law, and that's how this entity was created. We basically try to save you know, a species in Long Island, and using the law, we challenge the use of DDT in local courts, and that's how our organization started. And now we have about 900 employees around the world trying to find solutions for the most important environmental issues that are happening across the world. Some of the areas we're working, it's climate change, energy transition, which is the area that I'm working with, but climate is pretty much inserted in everyone's work stream. We also work with oceans, health, and other issues related to the environment. And in Puerto Rico, we arrived on the hand of a new foundation that was created just after Hurricane Maria. They thought that we could do energy work and basically build a microgrid or something similar in the island. And we accepted the challenge, and we've been here for 3 years working on policy issues such as the IRP, and finally installing rooftop solar plus storage in more than 40 households here in Culebra, which has a population of about 1,500 people. Next slide. So in terms of the public utility in Puerto Rico, PREPA, the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, they had a principal mandate since the 1940s to electrify Puerto Rico, something they did extremely well. And pretty much everyone has electricity in the island, and that happened in those decades. However, we've seen the use of fossil fuels that are pretty much controlling the generating fleet of the utility. There's issues of cost versus economic development that has affected a lot of the price of electricity in the nation, has affected how businesses, run their things. In the island, they have resorted to other alternatives in order to minimize those costs, and even have left the island for those reasons. So those costs are extremely high. Still, the island of Hawaii, or the state of Hawaii, tops Puerto Rico in terms of price. This was a monopoly till very recent, where the transmission and distribution system was given in a concession to a private entity, and the generation it's probably going through the same fate, because they're putting a bid, outside bid for companies to control the generation as well, and take it out of the public corporation. Basically, that brought us to an issue of transparency, because there was no way to finding out whether they were doing the right things, or whether the utility was spending the money where they had to spend the money in terms of improving the infrastructure that was needed. And now we probably see why it probably failed so many areas. Next slide. So in 2014, there was a new energy law that was passed. It was called the Energy Transformation and Relief Act. And basically, as it goes, that energy generated, transmitted, and distributed in Puerto Rico must be affordable, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory cost to all consumers. Basically, the authority could increase rates without any notice, and we had to accept those without any adjudicative process. Availability of energy supply, and I apologize for the sound. As I told you, I'm in the island of Culebra. And the energy policy mandates a continuous planning process, evaluating all energy issues in Puerto Rico, and it gives the regulator exclusive and primary jurisdiction on energy matters, except in some instances where the FERC, the Federal Regulatory Commission, has jurisdiction. Also achieve energy efficiency and ensure reliability and safety of the electric power system. Next slide. So the Energy Commission was the key component of the full and of the Transformation and Relief Act of 2014. That's why I was tapped to share I had two other commissioners, and we had a law that had many requirements, many issues that we had to handle in the first couple of years, not seen in any other jurisdiction in the mainland. Usually utility regulators or utility regulating agencies have been for decades in the US and not in Puerto Rico. It was supposed to be independent, specialized entity in charge of regulating, supervising, and enforcing all energy policies in Puerto Rico. Approve short and long-term plans for the utilities, such as the integrated resource plan that I will discuss later, and approve electricity rates. The first rate case was approved in 2017 after 27 years. So you can imagine how the price was affecting consumers, and it was not necessarily fair and reasonable, and we had to accept whatever changes they would made. That still happens in the water sector where it's still not regulated, and they constantly increase the rates without any input from the public. There was rulemaking for demand response, energy efficiency, wheeling, interconnecting rules, and other matters. So we spent a lot of time doing those things, but at the same time, the law was very specific on when we had to run some of this process that I was telling you, such as the IRP and the rate case, and also dealing with the bankruptcy of the utility in Puerto Rico. There was just a lot of things happening at the same time, but we were able to handle them even before the pandemic. Next slide. So they oversee all types of operations and processes and mandates related to efficiency and energy sector. It's a primary enforcer for the utility and the T&D operator and all energy producers. Basically, anyone from the public can file a complaint, and they will have a hearing at the Energy Commission, which is now called the Energy Bureau. Promote the diversification of energy sources, reduction of energy costs, be firm, effective in regulating the utilities without undermining, this is an important aspect, the contractual obligations with bondholders, because PREPA, as a public corporation, could issue bonds, and there were obligations for those bondholders. And one of the most important aspects was public participation, which we definitely try to make sure that all these administrative proceedings were really active on public participation. But we are understanding that also that the topic is very technical and difficult for the general public, but we were lucky to have the presence of many NGOs that were helping communities to understand, what these processes were like and how they could really make an impact in participating in these procedures. Next slide. Then in 2019, they amended this Act 57, and it's basically very similar to Act 57. However, it started talking about climate change, which I thought it was extremely good, because it's very important for the energy sector to be discussing these matters as we can create major impacts, mitigating and adapting to climate change. They set aggressive renewable targets, 40% for 2025, 60% for 2040, and 100% by and promote reduction of energy costs. It also eliminates the use of coal as a fuel alternative for energy generation. There's a huge generating asset. It's a private one that sells energy to the local public utility. So they will have to shut down burning fossil fuel coal as of January 2028. What they will do after, it's still pending, and it will be considered in the next integrated resource plan. Replaces 100% of public lighting to LED or renewable lighting by 2030, and it changes the name of the commission to Energy Bureau, because now they're under a big umbrella of a main regulatory body that includes also the telecom industry and other sectors, but not water. Next slide. And then the IRP is one of the major pieces in terms of planning. And I want to stress this because I usually see a lot of people proposing projects to Puerto Rico that not necessarily fit into this plan. About 36 states in the mainland use the same sort of planning process. And it means it's a plan that considers all reasonable resources to satisfy the demand for electric power services during specific period of time, including those related to energy supply, whether existing, traditional, or new sources, and those related to energy demand, such as energy conservation and efficiency. It has a 20-year horizon. It has a short-term and a long-term component. It's revised every 3 years, and it's an adjudicative process where there could be interveners and public participation. Interveners as active players in doing cross-examination to the authority, to the public utility, or they could file friends of the court brief, or they could just go to public hearings and just say what they think about the plan and put that to run. Next slide. So there's been 2 IRPs since the Energy Bureau started in 2014. The first one was approved in 2015. It was modified. It modified what PREPA proposed. PREPA is a utility, and there was a second one in 2019, which was modified by the Puerto Rico Energy Bureau on 2020. We had about 20 interveners in that process. EDF was part of this, was an intervener who filed extensive briefs, and we provided expert witnesses into the process. It's very like a mini trial, because you can even, there's discovery in the process. There's hearings where you do cross-examination, you ask questions to the utility, and basically the regulator at the end issues a final resolution, and you can appeal that to the Court of Appeals or even go to the Supreme Court. What they proposed was not necessarily compliant with the energy policy of Puerto Rico. It was not even meeting the 100% renewable target by 2050. It was depending on natural gas new infrastructure. They proposed 8 mini grids across the island with new natural gas terminals. The modeling they used was not reliable. That's at least what we said in our briefs. They were not considering hydroelectric generation and other wind alternatives that were possible for Puerto Rico, even when we had that infrastructure already in place. But we had to make sure that they addressed those assets, and they did not. There was the issue of centralized generation versus decentralized. We were saying that we had to consider all these impacts, such as hurricanes coming to the island. There were, the blackouts lasted for more than 2 months in most places in the metropolitan area, and here in Culebra, where I stand, it was longer than a year after the hurricane. So that's the issue of having everything centralized in the south in terms of generation, when the majority of the population lives in the north. And then climate change impacts were not considered as required by the law. They do have to talk and discuss environmental impacts in the IRP. However, climate change was not discussed at all in this plan. Next slide. So what they came out, basically the input of the communities, local organizations, and other interveners really helped put a better IRP, and it was modified in 2020. As I said, it basically procured contracts for installation to reach at least 3,500 megawatt new solar by 2025. The RFP for these resources must be open for all forms of renewable energy, not limited to wind, hydro, solar, PVs, virtual power plants, which was a major thing we stressed and we wanted to be included in the IRP, and definitely storage. There's also an RFP structure to procure contracts for battery installation, and to reach at least 1,360 megawatts by 2025, establish energy efficiency programs, reject all new LNG offshore terminals that were proposed. Regarding the 8 mini grids, we proposed that at least we pilot one of them or two and see how they tested before just investing so many millions of dollars in putting all those 8 mini grids. So that was accepted by the Bureau, and that's what they modified in PREPA's IRP. There was an extension given to a private natural gas generator, and then the coal power plant that is also private and which sells energy to the public utility. The issue of whether it could be converted to natural gas, it will be discussed in the next IRP, which will be next year. And then they made a statement in that resolution that climate change impacts will have to be included in the next IRP, and we'll see how all the environmental organizations will be definitely paying attention to whether they have strong discussions on those issues. Next slide.
If we could wrap up slowly or at some point.
Are we done?
Whenever you want.
Yeah, and this is sort of the last slide. I guess I'm going to talk I'm seeing that I'm unstable with my internet here, but all these things delay the implementation of the energy policy in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of groups working hard to make sure that we do when it needs to be done. And I think communities have a major role in implementing the energy policy and climate adaptation and mitigation actions that need to be happening in Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much, Agustin. And Marcel, we'll bring you on.
Good morning. Gracias, Ramón. I'm going to share my screen in 1 minute. First, go to the first slide. And thank you for having us here. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to share with you the part of my research that I've been doing here at University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. And today, I want to focus on critical infrastructure and energy justice, but I want to have a small presentation about the context of this. Based on Hurricane Maria, what you see here is the picture of Hurricane Maria, which is beautiful and terrible at the same time. And also, I want to put this in context with other events and how that could be useful in continental United States as well. For example, if we look at Superstorm Sandy in 2012, it was a hurricane, a major hurricane, but when it hit the coast, the wind speed were not that magnitude, but it was so huge that it had an impact on the network, on the electric network, creating the worst or the largest power outage in the continental United States. Now, when we look that into context, we look at the total customers' hours of lost electricity service, which I call choles. Sandy accumulated about 775 million of those, which was a lot. However, when we compare that to Hurricane Maria, which accumulated more than 3,000 million, it's relatively small. And when we look into average days without power, then the difference is even greater, because Sandy affected about 8 to 11 million customers, while Maria affected 1.5 million customers. So the average days without power of the customer affected by Sandy was 4 days. There were people that were weeks without power, but on average it was 4 days. Georgia's 1998, it was 30 days without power in Puerto Rico, but with Maria, we spent an average of 100 days without power, which is really something never seen. I haven't seen a blackout that is longer than Maria. And I want to mention why this could be important to some of you that might be in the United States. This is the graph that shows how many people were without power and for how long. So after 120 days, still 500,000 families were without power. And almost 200 days after the hurricane, still 62,000 families were without power. Now, could that happen in other places in the US? Well, if we look at 2020, there were a couple of hurricanes that hit this area in the Gulf. Particularly if we look at Delta and also Zeta that passed close to New Orleans, and they were major hurricanes. And they were not that far apart in terms of how I think they were like 2 weeks apart. So they came relatively fast, one after the next. Now, this is also a situation in other places. We have Irma a couple of weeks before Maria, but also in 2020, Nicaragua had 2 major hurricanes, category 4, that pretty much came in the same place, only a couple of weeks apart in this part of Nicaragua. So if we have, with the climate change, we expect that this is going to increase. And you might see in the Gulf and in the East Coast hurricanes that come one after the other with a greater magnitude. And you might need to prepare for not just days or weeks of power outage, but months. And that's what we have to do here in Puerto Rico. So going to talk about the impact, one of the greatest impact that have been studied is the death toll of the Hurricane Maria. These are different studies. They seem that they're different in terms of their numbers, but the difference is mainly how long they studied the death count. So the ones that had a study of months, they ended up estimating between 3,000 and 4,600 deaths. I used the 3,001 because that's the official study by the government, and it is a lot. So that's something that we need to consider when we talk about critical energy infrastructure. And with that, I would like to define, or maybe redefine, because sometimes we talk about critical energy infrastructure and we only focus on hospitals and some places that provide essential services, which are very important, critical infrastructure. However, I propose that we redefine what is a critical energy infrastructure to the building that needs to have power to prevent at least one death, which then that will mean that there are many houses in Puerto Rico that become a critical infrastructure that we need to address. Similarly, resilience, there are many ways to define resilience. I'm just going to talk about 2. And based on Hurricane Maria and the 3,000 deaths, most of those deaths were preventable. They did not happen with the hurricane. They happened afterward and as a result of lacking of services and mainly due to lack of power. So we have mature energy, cost-effective, that can be installed. We still haven't done it at the massive way that needs to be done. So I would say that for us to be resilient, there should not be more than 100 deaths if we are impacted by a category 4 or 5 hurricane. We're talking about major hurricanes. We should be ready for that. And if we look at a slightly more technical definition, then we should not have more than 1,000 million customer hours of lost electricity service, which is close to what Superstorm Sandy created with many more millions of customers. Now let's look quickly at how this customer hours of lost electricity service builds up in time. And so the way I divided this is into 3 different sections. The ones that recover the service first, which is about 1 million, they spent no more than 71 days without power. But then for the next 300,000 customers to get power, another 85 days pass. And the more time pass, the harder it is to recover or reconnect those families. So the last 200,000 customers, it took almost double the time that passed until then to reconnect those. And that's why the burden of those customers is much higher as compared to the first. And one way to look at this is that if you take care of these 500,000 families that were more than 71 days without power, then you can say that you will have no more than 1,000 choles, 1,000 million choles, and that people would not be without essential power service more than 71 days. So that's something very important when we talk about energy justice in Puerto Rico and how to best use the funds of mitigation and reconstruction. And the solution already exists, a solar rooftop system equipped with batteries. They could be small. This one is 1,000 watts. It's in the mountain of Puerto Rico. And I don't have time to talk about the whole story about this particular project, but it's very fascinating. And maybe we need something that is double this, about 2 kilowatts, and in hundreds of thousands of houses. And we have looked that there are many benefits for that, not only for resilience, but also for climate change. So let's take they have a critical look at this solution. And so first we need to look at, do we have enough rooftop solar? One of the projects that we have a collaboration with NREL, and the estimate potential for only residential rooftop is about, it's close to 25 terawatt hour a year. For you to have an idea, the consumption, the total consumption, not the consumption, actually the generation, the last few years has been about 18 terawatt hours. So the total potential is more than the total consumption for all Puerto Rico at a year. And also, do we have enough money? Well, there is about 70,000 million or 70 billion in reconstruction and mitigation funds that could be used, some of that, to cover the capital cost of this. And so then the thing is, are there other options? Is there any better option? And for this, there are different things, but I'm going to focus on one because it's the one that has been implemented now, which is solar farms. Is it a better alternative? And it's something that is done in other places, and I'm going to tell you why it's not better in Puerto Rico. First, this is the data that we have for utility scale solar and the generation. So after the Hurricane Maria, it went to zero, which is not surprising. Everything went to zero. But to recover the level that we had before the hurricane, it took 15 months. So even took longer than to recover the grid, which means that the utility scale solar cannot provide resiliency because it depends on the grid. We need something that does not depend on the grid to provide the resiliency that we need. The other aspect is the land. There is a study by NREL about the best lands for utility scale solar, and most of them are on a highly agricultural productive land in the south and the southwest. In the north, there are some areas with the aquifers and sensitive areas. So that is also a problem, the land use versus the rooftop solar, which is land that is already impacted. And to end the cost, sometimes we hear about projects 1.3 cents per kilowatt hour in Portugal, breaking records a couple of years ago. But in Puerto Rico, the contracts are 9 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour because there's no access to the affordable financing that other places have. And that's making it much more expensive. And so I would say that there's no need to give long-term contract 20-year. If somebody wants to do solar farms, let them compete in the markets, maybe 2-year contracts. And if that's what is best, they can take the risk, and then we'll see. We'll see and let the market decide in that sense. And so we have been working and looking into how the solar could help low and middle income families. We have a project, we can leave this is going to be in the presentation, and the link so you can see the report that we have and more details that you might be interested. And I want to finish by talking about the potential path. This is from 2018. I presented this in a conference in 2018. So remember that this is about a year after the hurricane, and we already saw the need. And just throwing numbers, I said, well, we need about 200,000 houses, those last that are very critical, to have rooftop solar system with batteries. I'm talking about small systems that, for example, can be brought down, the panels, before a hurricane comes. And that provides the basic necessities of refrigeration, one load of clothes to be washed every day, and things like that, lights, electronics. The money needed is only 1.4 billion, right? When we put that into the 70 billion total, it's really small. And the benefits are really, really big, particularly for this last group. Now, if we include the other 300,000 that I mentioned, then we're talking about 500,000. And I mentioned in 2018 that by 2025, we should have these. And that would require 3.5 billion of investment. And I have not adjusted the cost because the batteries are going down, the cost. So maybe what I thought of lead acid, now I'm thinking more lithium, but that's from 2018. And finally, 1 million houses by 2035, which is very much aligned with the study by Cambio that is very important, that studied the integration of massive decentralized solar rooftop into the grid. That would require about 7 billion of investment. And if you look at the numbers here, that will cover about 45% of the residential consumption. Those small systems, this is a minimum, right? Because some people can install a bigger system, but this is a minimum of 2 kilowatt system that will cost about 7,000 per house. And so this is the path that we have looked, and we need clean energy, but we need clean energy not only from emissions, but we need clean energy free from oppression. We are still a colony in Puerto Rico, and that's something that prevents some of these solutions to happen. So with this, I want to close, and I'm looking forward for the question session. Thank you very much.
Ramón, you're
That's
still
great.
muted.
That is great. Thank you so much, you three, for telling us. We do have some questions. I'd like to start with one from Jeff Berner, who says that Puerto Rico is highly dependent on oil. He was curious about the lessons and the key elements that we all can learn about how we can get different systems to get off of fossil gas and fossil fuel. What in all your discussions and planning, what both Agustín, Ramón, and not both, and Marcel, what are some of the key things that are going to let us not use fossil fuel anymore?
I want to start. I think that there's a lot of public pressure as well to the utility. I mean, I know the utility have been, at the beginning, they were always putting excuses that the grid could not allow a certain amount of renewables into the system. I mean, they changed the narrative. They have a mandate now, which they have to comply with. And I see sometimes delays through all these negative externalities that are affecting Puerto Rico, but there's a lot of pressure, and I see that being a factor. I will leave that to Marcel to talk more about the technical components. I think, but that's my opinion for the.
Well, one important aspect is to consider the time frame. Sometimes when we think of a very short time frame, the less costly option might be fossil fuels. But when we start looking at the longer time frame, then things change very drastically. And I think that's maybe something that have been discussed greatly in this network of how many years are we talking about. And there are examples of how that has been done. We should look, for example, at Vietnam. Vietnam in 2020 installed about 9 gigawatts of solar rooftop in very short time. I think it was mainly in 6 months. So there are many things that can happen. They're technically feasible, and the government needs to look for what is less costly, but not only today, but in the longer term. In Puerto Rico, for example, solar rooftop with batteries, if you look at financing of 20 years, it is a lower cost than the grid. So we are also at a lower cost than the grid when we look at financing in 20 years. And so we can do both, right? Look at the cost and also look at the environment, but we need to add and also subtract the externalities and the environmental cost to really make sense out of it. Because in the end, what we want is reliable power, but we also want a good quality of life that is not only based on getting the cheapest without taking into consideration other factors.
I would just add one other comment, which is that because Puerto Rico is embedded in the federal structure and power of Congress and so on, we should not overlook the weight that it has that, inevitably institutions and politicians in Puerto Rico, look to the bodies in Congress that have jurisdiction over the island. And, for a long time, and time makes a difference. I mean, the situation is changing now, but for a long time, a lot of the committees in Congress that had jurisdiction over Puerto Rico are the same ones that deal with energy. And it's no secret that most of those were dominated by folks with heavy backing from fossil fuel industry. So even after the hurricanes, after everybody started saying, yes, we need to get rid of, phase out, the heavy reliance on fossil fuels. At that time, you could hear some of the voices in some of these powerful committees saying, aha, what we want to do now is, this is a solution. Let's phase out coal and oil, and let's turn Puerto Rico into the natural gas hub of the Caribbean, and so on. And then, inevitably, if that's where the more powerful control over resources are, institutions and politicians in the island will also take account of that. But yet that's the same time that a lot of people in the island were saying, you got to be kidding, become a national hub for natural gas. What we need to do is actually move towards renewables as the law was passed in 2019. So I think the institutional political context can never be, fortunately it's changing, but it can never be overlooked.
That's correct. Great. Gabriela Bosquillo Santos has asked, it seems to me that most of the barriers are at the policy level, federal and local, and also the political will. How do we overcome these to implement the solutions the speakers have highlighted? Small community projects can help, but we also need bigger scale solutions.
Yes, I agree. And I would just say that it's something that we need to bring the science, with which we have done that, but also sometimes you might need to bring it to the streets. There has to be activism, because that we have the arguments and the science and the data behind does not mean that the elected politicians are going to act in that direction. So it's something that the elected ones have to see that is good for them. And sometimes we have to force that. So I'm not going to mention any specific strategy, but often it has to go beyond participating in forums and meeting with the officials, which we do. We meet with the government and federal and local. And it's a very challenging aspect, and it's a fight. Let me just put it like that. It's a fight, and we need to continue fighting.
Agustin, any comments on the?
Yeah, I'm a strong believer that you have to participate in the right forums, such as the IRP. I think that was key. We achieved a lot in the resolution, and we put our expert witnesses into the stand and I think that's very important. I think we're all learning, because this is the second time we are reviewing such an important document, but we need also the academic arena also to insert into that process, because they have great things to add or great value to add into the process. That's my.
I'd like to add just one component of that. There's apparently a lot of community and EDF and different projects and solutions going on around the island. So is there a way that those are coordinated and can have a bigger impact and lead by example to the official process? I mean, even in the United States, this intervener process, which is totally legal, and you got to be in the right forum for IRPs, et cetera. How does a community coordinate itself, the NGOs, and to show, you know, what the solutions really are, so that these people can understand?
What I saw was, at least, you know, Earth Justice is a major legal NGO in the mainland. They were the facilitators for, or the attorneys for all these local organizations that they were able. We would meet every other week just as a group and just discuss all these issues and strategize about how to best, you know, challenge what the utility was proposing and providing the adequate solutions. But I think Earth Justice was key to put everyone together in one table. They were representing most local organizations, and ourselves, we were on our own, but we worked together.
A quick follow-up to that. You know, when people talk about all these community initiatives, you know, small co-ops or small microgrids, or, you know, resilience hubs and so on, do these need to be run through and approved by the Energy Bureau, or how does that work?
To intervene, you say?
Yeah, I mean, if there are these small community
Yeah.
projects,
Well, I mean, so it depends on what if you want to put a microgrid, then you have to go through the regulatory process. Even for my little project here, which is 40 houses, there's then the utility has to approve the net metering and interconnecting of those houses to the grid. But that there was already a process to give flexibility into the utility to approve all these, you know, small generating assets.
Which we don't have much of here in the States, but Marcel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that the communities are crucial. It's the base, and they're the base of change, and we need to work with them. It's very difficult. It's like what I would say, a work of the ants, right? It's something that you have to do every day, and it's hard work, but it's very necessary. And we learn from the communities. We mainly learn from the communities. They do great things, and the challenge is how to bring those things that are done at the community level and scale it up. The IRP process are very important. I agree, there was a great success, more than what I expected. I was more pessimistic, so I was very happy that there were some things that did not pass and were challenged, and it was, I think it took a lot of work from different groups to have that success. Not absolute success, but some success. But those processes are not designed for communities naturally to intervene. And that's a big challenge for this process, and we need to keep working on how to improve that. Thanks.
Ramon, I'm sure you have a few more comments too, but I see I'm going to combine some questions from Larry Eisenberg and also, well, first Javier Moscaso has asked about VPPs. And EDP's attitude. What is a VPP? I'm sorry.
virtual power projects, is that what it is?
It's the virtual power plants.
Virtual power plants. Okay. So that's a rooftop system would be a virtual power plant. Yes, no, or is it a combination of them?
The question is for Agustin, but the virtual power plants is how we can aggregate. For example, let's say you have a 500,000 rooftop solar system with batteries, and then you aggregate them. Then you have something that happens in the grid, like a power outage in one section, and you can reinforce that, coordinates in those massive amount of distributed system. So it has a great potential, but there is a need to have a smart grid that can actually do this part of aggregating and then supply the service that the grid needs which could be like frequency control, voltage stability, or just power input.
So that's done outside the utilities. Okay. The final thing, if each of you could talk for 30 seconds, is a question about how about the bigger energy system and how that relates? How about things like efficiency and changing the lighting, and the are there other renewable technologies that could work on an island such as, or the islands of Puerto Rico?
The last time I checked, I forget who, there's a certain scoring of states by the level of how much they're actually leveraging the potential of energy efficiency, and Puerto Rico had most of it ahead of it. So I think, you know, in terms of the possible gains, so I think I'm glad to see that the IRPs and all that are paying more attention to that, because I think, you know, the cheapest energy is the one you don't have to use. So I hope that that's something that gets, you know,
Augustine.
action.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to consider all options. That was something that we stressed in the IRP as well. I mean, we didn't want to say this is the only solution. We still need to do some studies like offshore wind and other alternatives. I don't think even hydroelectrics. There's an infrastructure in Puerto Rico that should be considered, and it's been slow, the process of integrating those back into the grid.
Anything, Marcel? Go ahead.
Yes, we always talk about energy efficiency and then renewable, but we also need to talk about lowering consumption, right? Changing habits. That's a whole line of work. And there's one previous presenter that I need to connect with. Thank you, Ramon, for that, about how to live with some energy and have a good life. And one last thing is that we do need to consider wind, even solar farms, but not in the next 5 to 10 years. So we need to focus on keeping people alive. We need to save lives with solar rooftop PV, and then we consider, because this is a long-term thing, when we integrate, for example, electric vehicles, how much more electricity we're gonna need. So it's not over, right? It's just like the short term, this is what we need, but we need to keep exploring other renewable options. That include also how we're going to use the batteries and the solar panels after the life cycle ends. So there's a lot of work to do. It's not the end of it. It's just the next 5 to 10 years.
That's great. Thank you. We have 1 minute. Ramon, quick.
No, and I would just add to those comments that precisely because that issue of, you know, what's urgent to do in the long term and in the medium term, but also when you saw those curves of the power outage and all that, that's just an order of magnitude or two higher than what anybody would want to experience. So it's an urgency to deal with the people who suffered the most. You know, you don't want to have that twice. If you're the one living through it, you don't want to. So I think the researchers and community groups that have been very active for many years, especially in the last 5 years, their voices really have to be, because that's the only way it's going to weigh in to say, okay, yeah, it's a lot of resources, but you know, we need to focus on the ones most that need first.
That's great. Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank all of our speakers today, and I want to let you all know that the MIT Alumni Energy, Environment, and Sustainability Network will be presenting a seminar on home heat pump installation next month, the 16th of May. Please check out our website for information along the way. And I thank you all. We will be posting the slides and the video when they are available. Slides first, always come first. So you'll have to check back. If you would like to record what the chat has had, I believe on your chat buttons, there's a little 3 dots, and you're allowed, and you may be able to download the chat discussion in text, so you could find the URLs that people have referred to again. Marcel, Augustine, and Ramon, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. It may have been far more helpful than listening to Mr. Carey talk to the president of MIT, but that also was happening at the same time, and I'm delighted that 40 people were able to come. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you,
now.
Marcela and Agustin and Sarah for holding this, and
Oh,
MIT folks for
gracias.
supporting us. and all the speakers for, I mean, all the audience for showing up.